In the last part of Chapter 6, we want to talk about how nouns and adjectives function in the communication of ideas. You need to understand that Hebrew nouns and adjectives are an important part of creating any image that the author is trying to convey. Every sentence is basically a verbal picture. It may be a rather stark portrayal in black and white, or it may be colorful and vivid and contain lots of detail. But noun function is about how the author paints this picture, not about how the events themselves happen. You can have the same exact event and have it described in multiple ways and have the same words show up in different functions depending on how the sentence is constructed. For example, here you have a picture of a martial artist breaking a stack of blocks. And if someone was filming this, as he took the picture, he might be focused on the individual. The mental picture, if you will, that is conveyed by this visible camera is the man broke the blocks. That's what the photographer in this case is trying to capture, and that would be what the author communicates by the English sentence down below it. But you can take that same event, nothing changes, there's another photographer on the sidelines who looks at it, and instead of focusing on the man is now focused on the blocks. None of the objects in the event have changed, but their position in the sentence has changed and their function has changed because you're painting the picture in a different way. So here we would say something more like the blocks were broken by the man. So when we talk about the way in which we use terminology in a sentence and the way that nouns and adjectives function, we need to go back and look at things from the vantage point of this verbal picture. The subject of any sentence is the focal point of the scene as it is captured by the author. If you think of this camera, it will help. The subject is always in the center of the picture. It is the object that is the focus of attention. So the examples that we had before, we could find that the man broke the blocks, and the man is the focal point of attention. We could have the blocks were broken by the man, and the blocks become the focal point of attention. We could have another photographer that's looking at the crowd. The crowd was amazed by the break. It's happening at the same moment. It's the same scene, same event. Or the man was skilled, where we're capturing the same event, but we are, instead of focusing on the action, we're focused instead of the quality or state of the individual. In all of these sentences, the items in red highlight the focal point of the scene. They highlight the subject of the sentence or verbal image. The object is a term that we use to indicate the object that receives the action. Now, by object, we can mean the direct object, or the object that is directly impacted by the action, or we can talk about the object that is indirectly impacted by the action, the indirect object. So in these two sentences, we have the man broke the blocks. The man is the subject, he is doing an action, and what is directly impacted are the blocks that he breaks. But in the next sentence, the man showed the audience the blocks. The blocks are still the direct object. That's what the man showed. The expression the audience is actually indicating a secondary object that is secondarily influenced by this action. And in English, we often smooth that out by using the word to or for. The man showed to the audience the blocks. This is the difference between a direct object and an indirect object. Usually you'll pick those up rather intuitively. So we have to distinguish between the subject, what's the focal point of the scene, and then the objects that receive that action. You'll also find that the direct object, the one most directly impacted by the action, in Hebrew is often marked with et. This will only happen when the object is definite. Now, this probably stems from the fact that if the direct object is definite, it may be more easily confused with the subject of the sentence. Because typically, when you're talking about an object, it's the focal point of your attention. It becomes more specific. And so in a sentence that, and in a language that does not require a fixed word order, there could be a potential for confusion between the subject and object. So if that person or thing is specific, definite, then the word et will be used in order to indicate that it is the object of the verb, not the subject. So what words are definite? Well, proper names are definite. You would need to use et if a word like Joseph was the direct object. A noun with a definite article, the flock, is going to take the particle et. And you have not encountered these yet, but in future chapters when we learn nouns that have an attached possessive pronoun, my flock, his flock, her flock, those two are going to be marked with et to give you an indicator of the direct object. If you don't have that, then you are going to have to rely on context to figure out its function in the sentence. Now, in most cases, you're going to find that these are fairly intuitive to you. These are some sentences that come directly from the biblical text and are translated as literally as possible so that you can see how you will instinctively understand what the author is trying to get at. So in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 28, they cried out you. We understand just from the context that the word you isn't some direct quote. We're actually talking about the indirect object. And whereas in English, we always specify that with the little particle to, or preposition in this case, in Hebrew, it is not necessarily expressed, and so it has to be supplied from context. In the second example, all the land was weeping a loud voice. We understand that, but that's not how we would do it in English. We would again use a preposition. They were weeping with a loud voice. In Genesis 2:7, it says that the Lord God formed the man dust. Well, God formed the man, and God formed dust. He did both. And yet in good English, we're going to have to require that one of these be shifted into a prepositional phrase in order to make that smooth. We also have an example like Lamentations chapter 1, verse 8, Jerusalem sinned a sin. Now, this isn't emphatic. This is just a good Hebrew way of expressing things. And we would actually, in this case, leave it off and just simply state that Jerusalem sinned. So we have the subject, we have the object, which we can usually tell from the context, and then we also have predicate nouns, predicate adjectives, predicate demonstrative pronouns that we talked about earlier in the chapter, where the verbal idea is implied or stated with the verb is, are, was, were. X is Y. For example, with a stated verb, Haya David Melech. He was, namely David, a king. We would translate that, David was a king, or David was king. Not always will there be a stated verb. In most languages, the verb is, are, was, were is often simply implied. So in Joshua 23:34, we find the expression Adonai ha-Elohim. The Lord is God. We know we need a verb. We don't find one, so one has to be supplied from context. So we have the subject, we have the object, and the object is only going to be used when there is an action. The predicate noun is used when you're stating X is Y. So those three types of noun functions are actually exclusive. You'll have the subject and an object, or you will have the subject and a predicate noun. You will not have both an object and a predicate noun. You'll also find that you have the object of a preposition, and by this what we mean is that the subject is the focal point of the verbal image, the verbal scene. An object is anything that's on the periphery. Well, we talked about the direct object, the object that's impacted by the action. We talked about the indirect object, the object that benefits from or receives that action. And then we also have prepositions like on, with, in, at, that can also take nouns to supply supplementary information. So, for example, we can use this phrase, Shema LeDavid, he listened to David, and the preposition le is attached to a noun. We would call this the object of a preposition. It may or may not show up in your translation. Translation is always affected by English word choice. We could translate this, he listened to David, or he heard David. And English is going to require a certain grammatical construction for the English word listen, and there's a certain grammatical construction required when we use the word heard, and we have to adjust accordingly. Both of those are valid ways of translating the phrase. You'll also find that we can sometimes use nouns to create direct address. So in Genesis 41:13, again, as literally as possible, we have the sentence, me, Hamelech, the king, you restored to my office. Now, you've got a conversation going on between the cupbearer and Pharaoh addresses the king, and he addresses him as Hamelech, the king. It's very formal. In English, we wouldn't translate the definite article. We would see this as a way of restating the identity of this individual identified as you, and we would use it as a direct address. Me, O king, you restored to my office. You can also use a noun in the same slot as a word that is already present. We sometimes call this apposition. Restatement might be simpler to remember. In this case, we have the sentence, Abram took Sarai, his wife. Now, his wife is simply a restatement of the identity of Sarai. They both stand in the same syntactical slot. They are both direct objects. Abram took Sarai. Abram took his wife. And you will find times where you have more than one noun in the same slot, and the goal is not to indicate that there are more than one person or object that's receiving the action, but rather to just simply provide more clarity in terms of who and what is being affected by the scene at hand. So when you look at the nouns in a sentence, when you look at how they are used, these are the kinds of things that you'll encounter. Most of the time we do this very intuitively. When it comes to description of these, either in the grammar or in commentaries, in Hebrew grammars where you're researching information, you will find reference to them using this terminology. Subject to indicate the focal point of the action, the verbal image that's being portrayed by the author. Object to indicate the object receiving the action, whether that's the direct object being most directly impacted or the indirect object, the party or item to or for whom that action is happening. We have a predicate noun, which can be combined with the subject instead of an object in order to express the idea X is Y. We then have nouns that are paired with prepositions. They indicate extra information. And because it is a person, place, or thing connected to a preposition, it's an object with a preposition. It's the object of the preposition. Direct address, when we're speaking to someone and we want to call them by a title. And then recognizing that we will have restatement at times, or the technical term apposition, in which two nouns can clarify the identity of an individual or object by referring to the same thing. Sarai, his wife. Those are the kinds of things that you will see. You won't have any trouble with them as you're translating. It gives you a little bit of terminology and connects you back to some of the discussions you had when you were learning grammar as a child.